Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this event this afternoon. I'm looking forward to it enormously myself. It's co-hosted by the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics here at Queen's and by the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. My name's Richard English. I'm director of the Mitchell Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to welcome you. Maruška has asked just that I say a few words about the USA work that Queen's has been developing in recent times, of which the important Berkeley partnership, which Maruška and Merav have been leading, and of which this forms a part, is a really exciting feature. And what's happened over recent years is Queen's has tried to build friendships and partnerships with US universities in ways that we hope will transform everything that the university does, involving opportunities for students from the partner universities and from Queen's to have experience of working with scholars from the other university and spending time at the respective campuses on visits. And that's been one of the important aspects of what's developed here with Berkeley. But also in terms of research that's pioneered between academics at the various universities in the States and here in Queen's, or the dissemination of research ideas, the opportunity for important research-based dialogue, and the opportunity for pursuing ideas which will advance the work that's done at Queen's in partnership and hopefully contribute something as well to the work of the partner universities in the US. But in addition to the work with students and the research, there's also a commitment in the USA work of Queen's to try to address some of those global problems, challenges, issues and phenomena which can only best be understood if we work in partnership and collaboration rather than singly. I think today is a glorious example of trying to address some of those questions. So I think in recent times, as part of that work, the Berkeley partnership has been a hugely exciting development, which I would like to congratulate Maruška, Merav and colleagues on and to celebrate. But also it's been a way of trying to develop research and education and societal engagement in exactly the spirit which I think universities should adopt. So welcome today on behalf of the Mitchell Institute and the School of HAP. It's great to have this event, and now to carry on with the proceedings, it's a pleasure to hand over to Dr. Merav Amir. Merav.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to especially thank Maruška for organizing this event and initiating that partnership with Berkeley University, and I can only add to what Richard said about how important it is for all of us to foster these connections with across different institutions and here and globally. Just a few housekeeping announcements. So we're not expecting any emergencies, but in a case of emergency, the emergency exits are either behind you or through there. And to also notify or let everybody know, although I think you can't really miss it, that this event is being filmed, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So just know that if you're asking a question, you'll probably be filmed as well. So I'll hand it over to Maruška, who will introduce the speakers, and thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard and Merav. I'm delighted to see you all here. And I'm delighted also that we have some great speakers. But first of all, I would like to thank the professional staff at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, and also at the Mitchell Institute for logistical support, but also some people who have been from the very start when we developed the Berkeley connection, who have been very supportive. So Professor Alistair McKibben, Professor James Davis, Professor Richard English, and in Berkeley, in particular, Professor Jeroen de Wulf, who has been very active in supporting the connection through teaching and research as well. So before I introduce the speakers, maybe something about the conflicted Europe theme. I think it is very urgent to be thinking about conflicted Europe in the light of several things that are happening clearly the invasion of Ukraine and the current war, the fact that Europe functions as a fortress for migrants and refugees, and all the questions around that. Of course, the European Union, questions around Brexit, and so on. But also historical legacies, and we have two historians here, but we can think as far as going back to empire building, the First World War, Second World War, Cold War, end of the Cold War, and so on. So all these historical legacies are important to bear in mind when we think about current problems. And I think that's probably what we're going to learn today. So let me then introduce, first of all, Professor John Connelly. He is a professor of history from the University of California in Berkeley. He specializes in the history of Central and Eastern Europe, and his publications include From People into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe, published by Princeton in 2022, From Enemy to Brother, The Catholic Revolution in Teaching About the Jews, so published by Harvard in 2012, Captive University, The Sovietization of East German, Czech, and Polish Higher Education. So that was published by Chapel Hill in 2000. Now, we have seen him before because just before the pandemic started, he became a Fulbright Fellow here at Queen's, and we interacted for some months, and then John had to go back because of the pandemic. So I'm delighted you could come back here. So welcome back. Then Dr. Alexander Titov, he is lecturer in modern European history at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics here at Queen's. He is a historian of modern Russia, and he focuses on its foreign policy, Russian nationalism, and the political history of the USSR after Stalin. Currently, he's working on a book for Agenda Publishers on Russia and its foreign policy. And he's also, you might, if you're from here, you might have heard him on the media, because he's regularly commentating on current affairs relating to Russia. And his work has appeared in national and international media, including The Conversation, the Irish Times, the Independent, and the BBC History magazine. So welcome, Alex. So let me just start off to ask each of you, before focusing more specifically on your historical research, so to ask you more about your personal connection to Europe, and also your personal experience of Europe as a contested space, because we are not just professionals and academics, we are also beyond that wider, people with wider experiences. So Alex, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Really great occasion. I'm so delighted to be part of it. Well, in a sense, the first question is easy. I was born in Europe, had experience of contested Europe from my childhood when the Soviet Union was breaking up. So I was it's a lived experience. I was in Leningrad at the time, still in school years, so pre-teen, early teen, when all those happened. So yeah, change of borders, collapse of empires, well, disintegration or collapse is probably a wrong word. I would say it's disintegration of society, of states, of borders, resulting conflicts out of it, which I would suggest that the current war is, in a sense, a long durée can be understood within that larger context of the imperial disintegration. So contested Europe, yes, that's very much a part of my experience. But I would also add that when I soon after the end of the Soviet Union in mid-1990s, I came to UK to study, and then one thing led to another. I stayed here, but this idea of importance of understanding how different societies work. Idea of importance of ethnic, national, cultural identity, yeah, for understanding, well, yourself. Of course, when you're young, it's one thing. But as I was becoming more interested in studying history, studying Russia after I was already here for after some time. Then I began to, in a sense, rationalize and looking back at my experience in kind of a much broader perspective. Right? So in that sense, yeah. So contested Europe is pretty much an ongoing story, and I could say a lot more about the recent things, of course, but which obviously been huge impact on me personally as well. But maybe I will leave it to later when we talk about research and how it relates to the ongoing events.
Great. So John, same question for you.
Okay, so, and this is audible? Yeah. So I began coming to Europe when I was a teenager, 1977. I visited West Germany for the first time in Austria. My interest was basically to learn the language. I was, my mother's name was Fleischmann, so I'm of German background. And for that simple reason, I wanted to get to know the country that I'd heard so much about and that is featured so prominently in American media, right? There's probably no country that people are more interested in than Germany. For reasons that you know. So I went to West Germany, but when I was there, speaking of contested Europe, they obviously had different ideas of the past than we did. But what I found particularly interesting is that when you put on the television, you could get channels coming from East Germany. And so I was learning German, but then I was hearing a different message coming from across the border. First radio, and then I worked in a restaurant in 1980, and I could actually get East German television perfectly fine. And so I enjoyed watching these programs coming from the other world at the time with its own idea of history, claiming that the place that I lived was ruled by enemies of the people, imperialists, and that they represented something better called socialism. So my next step was actually to spend a lot of time living in East Germany and Eastern Europe. So in the 1980s, I studied in Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia. And what I learned about contested Europe is that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I lived actually for a year in West Berlin in the early 80s, and I traveled over a lot. And then I spent a lot of time in places like Leipzig and Rostock and Krakow. What you learned is that everything was different. Everything was in some ways the same, right? People sort of went shopping and had education and houses, but everything was different because it was filled with a different kind of purpose and meaning. And the state was interested in everything people did. And they tried to impress upon ordinary people like you and me a different idea, a different sense of the world and its meaning. So that was interesting if you're coming from Philadelphia, right? And you really haven't encountered anything like that. So there was a basic struggle about history at the middle of Europe that I think has sort of vanished. I mean, people don't recognize that this was thought to be serious and long-lasting, and there were a lot of people in the West, including myself, who found certain aspects of socialism in Eastern Europe to be attractive. And nobody imagined that it would suddenly vanish and disappear and collapse, right? People really thought in the long term there would be socialism. So that narrative sort of collapsed in the meantime, but two other contested narratives that I'll just mention that I encountered as a student occur in Poland. So I'm very interested in ethnicity, and when I was a student in Poland, I had a friend who was German, and her father came from Silesia, which was once Germany, is now Poland. And she said, well, he came from a German village, and everybody speaks German there still. They're all Germans. My father was German. And so I went with her to visit this village, 1984 or 85. And she said, here's, Uncle Hans and his wife, Margareta or something like that. They had good German names. And they're going to call you Hans because if I told them you were from the U.S., they wouldn't believe me. So we went on like that. And then I listened to these old people. And when they were together, these Germans, they spoke not German, but Polish. And I wondered, why are these Germans speaking Polish to each other? And I learned that actually they were Polish, that there was there was this minority between Poland and Germany that had actually been defying the attempts of both states to control their lives for centuries, actually. These are the Upper Silesians, the largest sort of regional minority in the region. So the fact that people could control their identity against the wishes of states, I found fascinating. And I guess the other aspect of contested Europe that I would mention these days is simply that some of the people that I made friends with back then in the 1980s have found themselves on both sides of this divide in Poland that seems to be unbridgeable, which you know about, right? Between advocates of peace, the Party of Law and Justice, and everyone else, essentially. And I find that disturbing, but still, in a way, intriguing that it's possible that reasonable people could see the world so differently, which is precisely what is happening in Poland and Hungary currently. So that would be my personal connection.
Thank you. So let's now turn to your research. And I would like to invite you to engage in a conversation about the ways in which your historical research relates to the current crisis in Europe. And we can, of course, think about several things, the historical dynamics of geographical borders, of cultural boundaries, conflicts around ethnicity, nationhood, intersecting identities, questions around empire and conquest, but also the longer-term dynamics of geopolitics within and beyond Europe. So, John, would you like to start? And then, Alex, you can take over. Thank you.
So this is a slightly longer statement that I'm going to actually use some notes to read from. But before I do that, I also want to just say thanks to Maruška and colleagues for making it possible for me to be here again. I had a lovely 3 months with my daughter in 2020 and delighted to be back for many reasons. It's good to see old friends. So I have a somewhat strange answer to the question that Maruška just posed, because I'm going to actually start from the question of identity, nationalism, ethnicity, but not in their own terms. I actually come at the question of nationalism and ethnicity from a different interest, which is an interest in the history of democracy. And one of the things that I did when I was sort of really bored in 2020 after leaving Queens, sitting around in Berkeley and nobody could go anywhere, is that I began reading a lot on democracy. And I'm currently engaged in a project trying to study the problems of German democracy. So my conclusion in the course of this work is that the history of democracy is inseparable from the history of nationalism. And that includes ethnicity, ethnic nationalism as well. May seem odd to say such a thing, because we usually assume that nationalism involves bigotry and chauvinism. A word that's used here a lot in Northern Ireland is sectarianism, right? And nationalism are thought to be synonyms. And that democracy is about freedom and rights and the self-determination of people. Nationalism is considered the enemy of democracy. But if you look back to the beginnings of the story of democracy in Europe, so mid-19th century, 1848. Is there a helicopter landing up? So, no. This is where I've been the last couple of months. I've been on sabbatical in Berlin. I've been almost constantly reading about 1848. Which is the beginning in Central Europe, so the area between France and Russia, of the history of democracy. You find that nationalism and democracy were actually the very same thing, one and the same thing. So 1848 was a time when suddenly it seemed possible for a few months that people had thrown off the old regime, kings and princes fled, and people from France to Bucharest and south to Sicily and north to Denmark were forming their own future. Of popular sovereignty. And what you find everywhere, but especially in Central Europe, so east of France, but all the way to the borders of Russia, is that when people thought of democracy, popular sovereignty, rule of us by us, right, they demanded national states, meaning states that had never existed before were supposed to appear when democracy became the call of the hour. This was true in Poland. It was true in the Czech lands, Bohemia. It was true in Germany, Italy, Hungary, Croatia, and elsewhere. It was second nature that no right, no idea of self-rule, no civil liberties could be gained without the structure of a nation state. Another way of putting this is to think of it in terms of liberalism. So we think of liberalism about individual rights. In 1848, throughout Central Europe, liberals who were really pushing political events forward understood that any kind of rights would have to be realized in places called Bohemia, Poland, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Croatia, and so on. And probably Ireland as well, but the experts are in this room. Right, that this was the framework for any kind of democracy and rights. So why didn't it work? Why did democracy not work? In 1848 or even later in 1918, has to do basically with conflicts over territory, withdrawing boundaries. This is something that Maruška asked about. So people, when they thought about Germany, they thought of Germany in historic terms. If I had a map here, I could show you, but Germany in historic terms was an enormous space, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, that included all of today's Czech Republic, much of Slovenia, much of northern Italy, much of France, much of the Netherlands, parts of Denmark, parts of Poland, and I think I haven't exhausted the list. And of course, all of Germany and Austria, right? That was Germany. The same was true of Hungary. In that period, was thought to include all of Slovakia, all of Croatia, much of Serbia, much of Romania, etc. So what I do in my work is I don't ask whether people were right or wrong in their ideas of what the borders of these nation states should be. I think it's the wrong question. What I try to understand is that democracy was, at this moment, the moment of creation of democracy, that really the origins of democracy in Europe, was not about right and wrong. It was about the force of argument, the force of conviction, the absolute belief in the right of creating a nation state in Germany. So the German left, this is something I've been really surprised about, the German left was ready in 1848 to go to war with all of Europe for a province, not just Schleswig-Holstein, but a part of Schleswig-Holstein, which is a very small province in Germany. Why? Because they believed the German people had to be whole and united, like France. So they're willing to go to battle in 1848 with Russia, with France, with everyone else. They don't think that they'll have to face England, but that's about it. So I try to read these stories without being moralizing and saying, you know, the Germans were wrong or right about their desires for borders, or the Czechs, or the Hungarians, or the Italians, and so on, or the Poles. I try to simply show that there were these desires to create nation states. They were often irreconcilable, and there's no point in saying that nationalism was to blame, because if you say that, then you're basically giving up on democracy. So the further story is not a pretty one. Parliamentary democracy didn't work, so this promise of national self-determination was fulfilled in other ways. One word for that is fascism, which I can talk about, both in Germany and Italy. The problem of the region I study is that to create nation states in the space of empires led to problems that help explain the rise of right-wing populism, fascism. But at the same time, the problem is that there is no other way to create democracy than within nation states. So I'm going to, do I have time for a brief, how am I doing on? I'm just going to read a brief statement. Timothy Garton-Ash wrote something about 20 years ago thinking about Kosovo. He had a reflection about European history that I think is spot on. I'm going to quote from his statement. He wrote as follows, I have argued for several years now that the separating out into small states or sub-state units, he was thinking of Kosovo, with clear ethnic majorities, driven, though it has been by manipulative and often cynical post-communist nationalism, nonetheless has precedents and counterparts in the rest of Europe. Elsewhere in Europe, people generally prefer to be ruled by those they consider somehow of their own kind. Only once thus constituted in some version of a nation state are they prepared to come together in larger regional and all-European units. Confederation, for example. A realistic liberal internationalism for the 21st century needs to take on board the insights of liberal nationalists from the 19th. So two questions emerge from this statement. What does it mean to say of one's own kind? Another would be, does this apply to today's Ukraine? And how so, if it does so? Two words about borders and empire. So borders were thought of as actually being completely inclusive when European democracy began. The idea was to include everybody within borders. So it's very different from how we think about them now, but absolutely necessary for the nation state. And that empire, which some of the people that I disagree with in the study of nationalism believe empire would have been a solution against nationalism. But within East Central Europe, empires were considered to be the anathema to self-determination and democracy. So that's the perspective that I've gained from studying Central Europe, and I think it has some relevance for today. But as I said, my mind has been in 1848 for the last 6 months, so forgive me if it seems antiquated.
Thank you so much, John. So Alex, basically the same question, wherever you want to stand.
Yes, so borders, conflict, contested Europe, certainly something which been at the forefront almost of everybody who is following any news in the last couple of years. But for me, it's, as I kind of alluded earlier, has kind of much greater significance, much longer term, both personal and professional importance. What I'd like to talk today is one of my recent research on comparative study of three empires. One of them is the Russian Empire. And I would suggest that that would have significance to understanding what is going on in Ukraine today as well. So basically what's at the heart of my research is the relation between imperial and national. Most study of nationalism, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, they are based on, first of all, idea of nations which need to regain independence, so assert themselves against dominant power, imperial power usually. So Central European and East European is a prime example. Other examples would be places like France, where the modern nationalism is often argued to originate. So again, a well-defined nation state. Okay, we can argue how well-defined it is and how it was done. In fact, there was a lot of contingency in kind of modern French borders, but nevertheless, by the time of the late 18th century, it was reasonably well defined. The problem comes when you study Russia in particular, is that in the 19th century and even in the 20th century and in the 21st century now, and that's the heart of the problem, is that its borders, not imperial borders, but national borders, are not well defined. And that, I would suggest, is the core of what we will have to understand now. So what I'm interested in is how imperial nations, so you have nations which are at the core of an empire. So for example, Russia, you have British Empire, to some extent French empires, German empires, if it was an empire. But they essentially have a core nation and the rule over other nations. In Russia's case and in many other cases, Ottoman Empire would probably be another one. There is no clear-cut definition between what is a home territory and what is imperial territory, right? In Russia, this particularly becomes acute because of the much kind of complicated history of its growth, right? As well as geography, that there is no kind of clear-cut. As in UK, for example, in England, you have islands, clearly defined borders. In France, Alps, Pyrenees, and so forth, the Rhine. In Russia, it's much more difficult. All right, so at the same time, it's clear that borders of the empire are not always the same as national territory. In Russia, there was never been the case that whatever is Russian Empire is the Russian national border. Even today, in Russian Federation, places like North Caucasus are seen as part of Russia, Russian Federation, but not necessarily part of Russian national territory. So the question, what I'm really interested in, is how and why some parts of empire become national territory and others are still seen as foreign, as not part of national territory, right? And this was part of my research, which will be published in September, hopefully, coming from HSC-funded project between UK and Japan called Competing Imperialism in Northeast Asia, where I study process of appropriation of territories in Northeast Asia between Japanese Empire, Russian Empire, and the Chinese Empire, Qing Empire, and the later Chinese Republic, or the People's Republic of China. So essentially, what my key, I'm not going to go into great detail, I'm just going to highlight key points, is that they started as imperial territories. Broadly speaking, more or less the same territories are now seen as national territories. Lots of contested territories in between them. For example, Sakhalin, the Maritime region, the Amur region, the Russian Far East was contested territory. Manchuria, Northeast China was contested territory between China, Japan, and Russia. Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, all were contested. Now, with a few exceptions, such as Southern Kurils, they are broadly accepted as being part of national territory, including island of Hokkaido. So how did this happen? I will suggest in my research, which I'm not going to go into great detail now, but essentially all three empires, and it's interesting that you move from Europe and go to Northeast Asia with different empires, different nationalities, different ideas of ethnicity. All of them, my argument is, basically used the same form of appropriating a territory which started as an imperial territory and then making it national. And those are basically ethnic colonization, claims of first discovery or ideas of superior civilization, ideas of natural borders, that territory naturally belongs either to Russia, to China, or Japan. Often in cases which even 150 years before, they were not seen as natural. So Hokkaido was not seen, Etso was not seen part of Japan's natural territory. Manchuria, the ethnic Chinese were not allowed to settle there until the end of 19th century. Russia did not even possess, didn't know about the maritime region until it acquired it from China in 1860, the Treaty of Beijing. But 50 years later, those territories are national territories. How did this happen? So those are the process: ethnic colonization, construction of arguments about the natural belongingness of that territory, construction of idea of superior civilization or the first discovery, and various forms of mnemonic appropriation, including through cultural creation of cultural artifacts and linking them with that territory. So. How is that relates to the current war in Ukraine? And again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically, if you look at, well, I'm looking at Russian, pronounced Russian officials and influential speakers, essentially they very much follow the same idea, right? In the Far East, because it was a new territory for both nations, for all three empires, they couldn't use the most effective one, the idea of ancestral land. Yeah, so this our ancestors lived here, therefore its territory belongs to us, which I think is the most common used argument for claiming a territory in Eastern Europe, or certainly in Europe in general. But certainly that's been used by the Russian officials, idea of aged old historical land belonging to Russia, which were given by the Bolsheviks to Ukraine by mistake. Yeah? So that's one claim. And that can extend to quite significant areas. You know? So you can claim a lot. The basic claims and counterclaims on this basis can go on forever. You can never stop. And I think it's important to know that it's not a matter of finding the truth or who was there first, but just to understand that this is a mechanism for appropriating territory rather than accepting it at face value. Right. So again, issue of ethnic settlement. This idea of Russian and Ukrainians being the same people is pretty much speaks to this idea that everybody who speaks Russian is Russian. Again, same as in Germany and France. Idea of appropriating territory because ethnicity understood often through language. Again, this draws on a long tradition of Eastern Slavs. Identities of Slavs, which originated at least in the 18th century, if not earlier, and various historical cultural mnemonic arguments as well. All right, which, for example, baptism of Rus happening in Kherson, Khersonес rather, in the 10th century. Right, therefore, Russia as a heir to Kiev and Rus. Should have Crimea as well. So all those things, plus natural borders, of course, and strategic argument, again, issue of NATO expansion, etc., etc. So all those things, I would say, it's not new. There's nothing invented in this, in the arguments put forward by Russian officials. It's actually a well-established toolkit of national appropriation, which has been used by empires and nations throughout. The question is, what to do about it, and how, well, the related question is why there is always contested territories, but why, resort to force of arms to settle that. That's another question which I think we might discuss later. But broadly, that's it. The issue of contested borders, contested territories, and how there are consistent policies of assimilation and appropriation of those territories actually speaks not just in Europe or Russia, but actually extend quite far further afield into Japan, China, and many other countries too.
Thank you so much. My own work is, or some of my own work deals with Czech art and politics. So from the Habsburg Empire up to today. I'm slowly becoming a historian. I'm an anthropologist, but I think any good anthropology has a historical interest. But because of this, I asked both of you to choose an artwork, try to challenge them to think visually, and to also think about a particular artwork that triggers very important questions exactly about the topic that we're talking about. So about Europe, it contested nature, and so on. So maybe Alex, you want to go first, and it would just be the next slide. So it's okay. You can stay where you are. I'll move the slide.
As long as I can actually have a look at the picture. Okay, so this is a picture by Vasily Surikov, done in the end of the 19th century, 1895, called The Conquest of Siberia by Yermak. So Surikov is a famous Russian painter, and key events are often, you find him, particularly in the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg. He is quite a significant representations there, historical painter. So why this picture? Well, Surikov, interestingly, was a native of Siberia. He was born in Irkutsk, then moved to Moscow and then St. Petersburg. But he is painting this picture, which is called the Conquest. Right? Conquest, and if you look at the picture itself, it's quite a violent affair. The Russians advancing from the left against the local tribes, the Blue Horde. You have issues of identity there, Russian flag, St. George's banner, the Orthodox religion, and idea again of superior firearms civilization and so forth. The question is, why is Surikov calling it, how does he reconcile the idea of him being native of Siberia, coming from there, being himself a Russian painter, Russian patriot and so forth, and at the same time, clearly implying that it was the Siberia before the Yermak came, the head of the Cossack band, which first conquered Siberia, part of it anyway, that they were conquering something alien. It wasn't Russia's before, right? They are invaders. And I think this goes very much to the heart of what I was talking about just earlier. First of all, that Surikov himself does not see any contradiction or irony there. But in fact, he says that Siberia is very much part of Russia, despite it being conquest, despite its being there before Russians arrived. It's now part of Russia, and this is seen as a kind of as a symbolic, important painting in that process. And I think, again, the painting itself in many ways appropriates Siberia, because you see it everywhere, in every textbook and everywhere, that that first of all, it was a long time affair, 15th century, 16th century, in time immemorial, so to say, before the Russian Revolution, before the Peter the Great's reforms, so the Ivan the Terrible's reign. In fact, that it's now majority settled by the Russians, right? So ethnic colonization, mnemonic appropriation, ethnic colonization, and also idea of natural borders as well, that it was a natural event for Russians to spread eastwards since there was no natural borders to speak of, conquer it, settle it, and make it their own, right? And I think if you look at today as well, there is no question asked that Siberia and Far East, which is much later, 16th century against the late 19th century, for example, that all those territories are intrinsically Russian. And I think that this is very much within Russia. Very much speaks kind of as illustration to my argument that there is this process of appropriation can be broken down into several key elements, and one of them, painting pictures like this, propagating them, as well as settling by ethnic settlement and others, is very much a part of it. So,
thank you. So I asked John the same question. I'll just go on to the next slide. Yeah. I put them in two. So the first and then the. Yeah. So this is the next one. Yeah, just, just tell me to move.
Fine. Yeah, that's it. So my slide. Oh, by the way, Maruška, it was a brilliant question. I wasn't when I first received it. I thought it was a somewhat quirky question, but in fact, I discovered that it's a very generative question to ask us to show a painting, because it turns out. Well, I first thought, what am I going to do? Well, Kandinsky, Klimt. What am I going to show? And then it occurred to me that I've been showing people this painting for months now, without thinking about it as a painting. I just thought about it as a representation of a historical event.
This is why we need interdisciplinarity. We cannot just rely on historians.
No, it's absolutely true. So I didn't know anything about this painting. I simply was interested in this event, which is the destruction of Heidelberg in 1693. How many of you ever heard of this destruction of Heidelberg? Couple. No, it's virtually unknown, because Heidelberg we always think of as this one city that survived World War II completely intact. But if you ever have been up to the Heidelberg Castle, you'll note that it's actually a ruin. And if you read Wikipedia on Heidelberg, you will learn that there was this event in the 17th century in which every building in Heidelberg was destroyed except one, which is Hotel zum Ritter. It's still on the marketplace in Heidelberg. I was a student there at one time. So this painting is important for the study of modern nationalism, because it represents a new spirit of an understanding of who Germans are and what Germany is, that emerges in the 19th century with a force that is new and it's unprecedented, and it requires historical explanation. So what happened in the 19th century is that school books suddenly started appearing throughout Germany, indicating that Germany was not simply an event in history with certain dates in its past that people had to know about, but that there were things that had happened to us, to the Germans, that we desperately need to know about, because it's our own past as well as fate in some sense. It's who we are. So what happens is, what I argue in recent work is that the most appropriate way of describing nation, what a nation is a story, right? So a story with a plot, with characters, with drama. And what happens in the 19th century is that story emerges as a standardized form, and it emerges not simply as something people read about, but something that draws people in, so that people don't talk about the nation or other nationals as they, but instead, just like the school books in early 19th century Germany start talking about we, this happened to us, right? So if you go to the 1790s or the 1690s, you can find representations. If you could show those two pictures, I'll talk a bit more. So these are woodcuts that emerged at the destruction of Heidelberg in 1693 at the time. It was thought of as being a great crime because it was a wanton event carried out by French forces that wanted to subdue that part of Germany, impose their will. Louis XIV wanted to impose his will upon prostrate Germany. But it's, as you can see, there's in one representation is of burning buildings and a destroyed castle. Another is of this French criminal, French military officer. But there's no sense of people beyond that one person, right? Whereas if you could move Maruška forward to this slide, it's completely different. So it's color, for one thing. It's an actual painting. It emerges in the 1850s. It's before Germany is created, but it's imbued with this sense of the new sense of nationalism that emerges around the year 1800, so right after the French Revolution. And you can see that women are prominently featured, as well as children. And you can see the expressions on people's faces. And the painting is reaching out to you, if you were Germans, to identify with these people and to have a sense of their torment. And also to recognize that there's a great historic wrong that's been done to Germany, namely that it had no proper state in 1690, nor, by the way, in 1854, 55, when this was created. So it's us. It's we. It's not something happening to people in the distant past. It's happening to you and me right now, and it will continue happening until Germany has a state, which, as you know, occurred only in 1871. So I think this is, Maruška, again, thank you. It's a perfect representation of what happens in the 19th century. Is that people had known for centuries that there were Germans and Czechs and French people and Spaniards and Croats and Poles and the like, but it's only after 1800 that people become concerned about these units as things that need to be protected by war if necessary. War was thought of being a virtuous thing. in fact. And this was a liberal point of view. This was not a right-wing point of view. This was a left-wing point of view in this period. So maybe just one final comment. The reason that this happens in the early 19th century, why is it does this shift occur, has something to do with what Alex referred to earlier, which is the French Revolution. This revolutionary, this new idea that people should rule themselves and not be ruled by kings and people who have no justified right to rule, kings and princes and the like, and people ruling by divine ordinance. But it's also because at the same time Germany was absorbing this message of popular sovereignty, Germany was actually occupied by French troops from 1792 to 1814. And what France did is it conscripted Germans into the French army. So this is another fact that you may not have heard, but 1/3 of the troops that went with Napoleon's Grand Army into Russia were German, right? So Germany was living under foreign occupation. The view of by Germans about German history in the 1850s was that Germany had been suffering for generations because of the lack of a strong state, and it desperately needed that state. And that explains the fervor of creating a national state in the early 1870s that was supported across the political spectrum. But that's another story. Anyway, but that's basically what's going on in this picture. And I think it seems to me to be a pretty successful use of art for political ends.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I like, John, the way that you said that the painting draws people in. So going beyond the idea that paintings just have meaning, as your painting also showed, but they actually have affective power over people. And this is exactly what, well, I think for the last 20 years, people in anthropology, cultural history and culture studies, art history as well, have been claiming that we have to look for the affective power of these objects. And that takes me to the next question, actually. This is the last one, which focuses on emotions. Now, emotions is also one area of research I've been interested in, particularly the relation between politics and emotions, whereby all politics is, of course, inherently emotional. The idea of the rational actor, well, we have thrown that aboard. That does not mean that all emotions have political relevance. I think what is interesting is where certain emotions that might be quite, in a way, innocent, like nostalgia for a time past or for a country or whatever, can become actively politicized and can become maybe nasty, kind of oppressive ideas about us and them, and which is very territorial as opposed to just love for the country. But anyway, so this is then your challenge to think about conflict and contestation as inherently emotional processes. So how then, as historians, could you bring in the topic of emotions in your work? But I'd like you to reflect on the other person's presentation. You can make connections to your own, but let's just try to think about each other. It's very hard to orchestrate a conversation, but this is then one attempt of being in conversation. Alex, maybe you want to start?
Yeah. Well, I think what just came up just now when talking about John was talking about the painting and about this idea that actually nationalism in the 19th century was a progressive idea. 20th century kind of turn it side round. It's something horrible, something not to something to avoid. 19th century it was idea of creating popular legitimacy for the rule. That it was a mechanism for breaking up empires in some cases was creating, such as in the German Empire, it was created after eventually became an empire. But this idea of nationalism, the same thing, idea of us against them community, which can actually in different periods can perform quite a different function, I think is very interesting. And I think that's what historians are about, is that we can show how these things can change and how the past can be different. Just another point I want to make about the emotions. You're absolutely right. And I think it was David Hume who said that it's not contrary to reason to prefer scratching my finger to the destruction of the universe, right? So this idea that reason, that you can, again, John says something, you know, Poland is so divided, it's horrible, but was not Brexit Britain so divided? Was it not pointless, or America, Trump's America so divided? Still is, I guess. That there's no amount of rational arguments that you can produce to the other side to convince them. It's not about argument, it's about feeling, it's about emotion. And I think nationalism, paintings, the ideas of kind of heroic past or common suffering and so forth, depending on the nation, actually is precisely the reason why it's being used so often, is because rational arguments just means to achieve something else. But the reason what springs people to action is actually emotion, right? And I think, yeah, that's very much what I think was came through both, I guess, John and well, I guess some of my talk as well.
Yes, thank you. So I guess the question that always emerges when you talk about Russia these days is, why is the support of the population in Russia so strong behind what to the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, seems to be an aggressive war against, against a victim that was in fact not threatening the security of Russia. At least that's the way that I think about it. And I think the recourse to emotion would be one way, at least, of approaching the question. And the question is, what sort of emotions are being triggered in the Russian population that generates this support? So I wonder whether there one would look at the ironic history of Russian imperialism, which is that imperialism elsewhere has seemed to be a nasty character. In Britain or in Netherlands or France these days, you can't really get away with saying that there was something virtuous and wonderful about the old empire, right? Whereas in Russia, it's precisely the opposite. So I guess the question, right? So people, when they think of the history of the Russian Empire, it was a savior of humanity, and it focuses, of course, on World War II, and on the fact that it was, ironically, the Russian Empire that destroyed the German Empire to a large degree, which is in some ways the great historical victory of any historical victories, right? A paramount victory in history. But I think that the emotional charge of pride, that Russia stood behind this, but also of what shall we say, outrage that the rest of the world doesn't understand this, right? So this combination of both sort of positive and negative charges perhaps would get us pretty far along the way of understanding what is going on in Russia. And I want to note that I was also very interested in your discussion of the relatively expansive borders of Russia over time. It's also true of Germany. Germany, it's not very well known that Germany intended to be a continental empire, comparable really only to Russia. And this is a word that Hannah Arendt actually used in discussing imperialism. She talked about several continental empires: the Habsburg, the Russian, and to a lesser extent the German. But like today's average Russian, the average German of, let us say, 1940 believed that all of Bohemia, all of the Czech Republic belonged to Germany. And it was, again, it was for this deep level of pride that people have in their own association with the nation that caused them to believe that. And they were willing to fight for it, you know. I mean, I had a boss in Berlin in the 1980s, and he said that when he was born in 1927, and he was an apprentice at Siemens in Berlin. He said every boy of his age, as soon as they reached their 17th birthday, they volunteered to be in the Wehrmacht. This would have been, I think, 1944. Why? To protect Germany, right? Germany in the sense that I've been describing it, which is these massive borders, right, including a lot of territory in Italy, Poland, etc. Rational, not rational. I will say one thing, Alex. I think that sometimes emotion and argument do mix, right? So you said that it's not about argument, but I think, unfortunately, if you go to Russia, there'll be this heady mixture of both, you know, of a sense of outrage and pride, but also a knowledge of Russia, or a portrayal of Russia's history in a way that seems to make Russia's behavior necessary and virtuous, right? The problem that I have thinking about Russia in terms of German history is that it took World War II to destroy the German imperial idea, the idea of Reich, including all of this territory. what event could possibly destroy the Russian idea of empire and permit Russia to behave as a quote unquote normal actor in international affairs? I don't know. Anyway, that would be my.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree that, as Levitt, one anthropologist, said that emotions is where you can conceptualize it in such a way that it happens where meaning and feeling meet. So it's not either one or the other. So anyway, I think we should open this up. We have maybe about 20 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question, yes, I can hand you the microphone.
Hello, thank you. Both speakers emphasize the extent to which states depend on national sentiment, the stability of states, particularly democratic states with their income transfers and resource sharing and so forth. But isn't it also true that states themselves generate a sense of national identity? I mean, what forges Frenchmen out of Burgundians and Bretons and Ossetians and so forth? Isn't it very much the state, conscription, taxation, mandatory education, and then also the universal rights that balance out those obligations, you know, like suffrage and formal equality before the law? There was a United Irishman here in Belfast that took a very radical view when he was trying to rationalize his acceptance of the Act of Union. He said, what is a country but a free constitution? Of course, it didn't quite work out like that for Ireland and the United Kingdom. But it does come back then to Dr. Titov's question. Why is it that states are able in some circumstances to bridge quite significant differences of language, culture, to build national community, in other cases not?
Anybody wants to?
I could say something for the Central European case. It's not universally valid, but it's true for the area between France and Germany. The first thing is the state's important, but the national movements were fully present before any states emerged. And that's something that's underrated in the historical literature or the theoretical literature by Ernst Gellner and others, for example, right? So, even after the German national state was created, it had to deal with the fact that everyone knew that it was an incomplete state, that it left out 1/3 of all Germans. So not a widely known fact, but in 1871, the state created by Bismarck actually did not solve the so-called German question. But of course, then it got about making German citizens that by the time World War I came around, Saxons and Swabians and Bavarians, they understood themselves as being one people, having pretty significant linguistic differences, as you say, right? And other countries, well, no, they were German. Well, in the eyes of that time, I would say 80% of Austrians, if not more, thought of themselves as ethnic Germans. And in 1918, as you know, Austria wanted to vote for. But in terms of Germany's regional differentiation, I would say what Germany fell back upon was an ancient idea of Germany. There was an idea of Germany in the year 1000. And that was a powerful idea that caused, overall, that's why when people looked at this painting, this is taking place in Heidelberg, but people in Königsberg or people in Silesia felt a kind of an affinity with the people involved there. And that has to do with this earlier tradition, despite the huge differences in German language. But there are other cases where states do not bridge those gaps. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, even though it's essentially one language running from Croatia all the way deep into Serbia, essentially one language. So it's difficult to say, but I think one way that I'd like to think about this is a common story that is inherited partly from the past, but then has to be sort of standardized and generated for the future. And so there's a story about Bohemia, let us say in the 12th century. There's no story about Czechoslovakia. There's a story about Croatia going far, far back, but not about Yugoslavia and so on. So I think we have to keep several factors in mind, but I know that's not a universally valid answer, but that would be my attempt to begin answering your question.
If I may just quickly add to that is that, okay, so nations are constructed to an extent, but some are constructed better than others. I think that's probably was the question. And I think, going, this big divide in in national studies about that. Anthony Smith was talking about kind of ethnic basis of nations, right? So ethnicity is not the same as nation, but it helps a lot when you have some basis for constructing nations out of it, right? So it's much easier to construct where something existed for in some shape or form, like a Germany, in terms of common culture, common language, common ideas about Holy German Empire and so forth, or Russia, where you can kind of create ideas about Eastern Slavs having common origins, and this kind of heated historiographical debates about who separated from whom and what and to what extent and so forth. When you kind of take something completely over and start to create something like Yugoslavia, perhaps, which also didn't have particular time. So you have a duration, ethnic basis, and so forth. And I think it goes much wider as well. So it's one thing is for Putin to say something about it, but it's if he says things which doesn't resonate with Russians, then it will fall on flat ears. So obviously, this is much deeper thing than just manipulation from the above.
Okay, we have another question here.
Okay, so it's part question and part comment. I've done some study of national anthems, and maybe that's a different lecture another day, about how national anthems come into being and what they represent. Here we are talking about Europe. So I've known some really good national anthems around the world in more recent times. But European national anthems that I have studied, with the possible exception of the famous German drinking song that became the German national anthem, which is quite all right. Most other national anthems are either jingoism or doom and gloom or both. So you have got Soldiers of Destiny, you have got Marseillaise, you have got God Save the King and Damn the Scots, and so on and so forth. Do you know of any European national anthem which is not about conflict, not about struggle? And by the way, that also applies to American national anthem, bomb busting in air and the rest of it. But do you know of any Western and especially European national anthem that is not about past conflict or past identity crisis, other than possibly Deutschlandlied, that those nations in their modern persona can be proud of? It's a provocative question, but you have studied Europe so well, so maybe there is an example there.
I think they all try to raise emotions in a certain way. I think in your book you talk about Polish and Ukrainian anthem. That's we're not dead yet.
Yeah, that's the. Do you know? Have you studied the Polish national anthem? Poland is not yet dead as long as we are alive. It's not a very positive sort of sounding message, is it? But it's popular, and apparently the Ukrainians found it to be compelling enough that they've adapted it as well. But I don't know enough about national. I will tell you that I think there are different kinds of. I said nation's story, but I think some stories are tragic and some are heroic, glorifying. And I think the West European nation, not including Ireland, by the way, but the sort of the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danish traditions of nationhood tend to be more positive, glorifying the nation, whereas the Central European stories tend to be this sort of picture here. The nation being the victim of foreign forces beyond the nation's control. And this is common in Serbia, Hungary, Poland, the Czech lands. There are events in the past in which the nation's fate was taken in the hands of some rapacious foreigner, as is happening right here. And that this is not the sort of, I don't know about the national anthem, but I think that this is reflected in sort of the stories that people were telling in the 19th century. This is sort of the basic story of Germany that needed to be corrected. So where you have tragedy, you need redemption. You might also say that it's a difference between an imperial story and an anti-colonial story. So the West European nations, not including Ireland, by the way, tend to be imperial. So the British national tradition tends to be imperial, expansive, making history rather than reflecting upon history, whereas the East European and Central European traditions are more tragic and lamenting the past, but also imagining a better future. It's contained in most of those national anthems, I think.
Yes, I'd just like to ask you about if you could say something about ideology, between the difference in Europe between socialism and nationalism. How would you kind of describe that? And if it's kind of perceived that socialism can defeat nationalism, and do you think that's a possibility for an ideology to be supreme over another one for whatever reason?
Well, socialism was supposed to overcome nationalism, right? So there's a class solidarity as opposed to national solidarity. In practice, it's always the other way around. I think John can talk about the Eastern Central Europe. I would just mention the idea of, for example, one of the topics we do in my module on history of 20th century Russia is why why is Stalin still popular contemporary Russia? And the question is, it's not because people are ignorant or because they like socialism or they are communists and so forth, but because he made Russia great, right? Because he took over Russia with a wooden plow, and left it with an atom bomb. That's basically the nutshell, right? So the fact that Stalin, for example, is more popular than Lenin is precisely because that the most enduring and most appealing part of the Soviet legacy was great power nationalism rather than actual socialism.
Yeah, so I'm like Alex, I'm sort of I tend to believe that nationalism has the power to subvert socialism almost everywhere, including Eastern Europe. Say in the 1940s and 50s, virtually every East European communist regime managed to be in some ways nationalist. The extreme case was Romania, which became kind of almost a fascistic state. That said, I think so after 1848, and the political spectrum in Europe divided and expanded to include beyond liberalism and conservatism, indeed socialism. Socialism in the Central European form was national in the sense that socialists imagined national states. I would simply say that the kind of nationalism that socialists represented was preferable to the nationalism represented in forces further to the right, including conservatives, but also, in other words, it was a gentler kind of nationalism. It was about, so for example, the Austrian Otto Bauer, you may have heard of, who was a theorist of nationalism. He imagined long-term assimilation into German culture of Slavic peoples, but by peaceful forces. He thought it would be through the strength of German culture. So it's sort of a mild and indeed liberal nationalism is preferable to other kinds of nationalism. So I don't think that socialism can, as an ideology, actually overwhelm and overcome nationalism and cause people to ignore national distinctions. But in practice, when socialists get together across boundaries, they tend to cooperate. They believe in cooperation. They're people who exist for reason, right? Like liberals of an earlier time. Well, so I think it's the place to look if you're looking for international cooperation, generally speaking. And I'm not trying to. By the way, I would include Christian democracy to some extent in this conversation as well. It's a kind of liberalism, right? But the nasty sort of nationalism that emerges in the late 19th century, which leads to fascism, that's only one kind, and I think socialism is a good antidote to that. You see that, by the way, in interwar Austria, where there was a facing off of the left under Otto Bauer and others against a center right that was actually quite intolerant.
I just kind of quick add that even in the Soviet Union, socialism first became as a way of promoting national cultures, even if within the confines of a very kind of centralized state. So kind of issue of Koreanizatsiya and promotion of local languages and so forth, and creating a federal structure, for example, which when the Soviet Union collapsed, it collapsed along Soviet established borders of Union republics, which for quite a long time actually helped avoid a Yugoslav scenario, but not forever.
Do we have time for one last question?
Thanks to you both. It's been really kind of interesting. My question is really just asking you to, I'm interested in your thoughts on what the role of the professional historian is in all this. Do we just sort of passively analyze the force of history in a sort of fatalistic way, or, do we have more agency? I'm struck by a couple of comments, John, that you made. One, that saying nationalism is to blame is to sort of give up on democracy. We're stuck with nationalism, even if many liberal academics don't like it. And then your idea of nationalism as a story with a plot and a drama, I think it's a very compelling kind of metaphor. And it reminded me a bit of Eric Hobsbawm's famous comment when he said historians are to nationalism as poppy growers are to opium addicts. We supply the raw material of that kind of narrative. So I'm kind of wondering, what is the role of the professional historian, but also history as it's taught, by the state and in schools? I know that's a big question, but I'm asking it in a specific context, because over the last 10 years, we've had the decade of centenaries here. And I've had a long-running argument with some of my anthropologist colleagues, not you, Maruška, but others, who argue that commemoration and so on is really just about the performance of political power in the now, and the stories themselves aren't that important. The stories, you basically have the same kind of stories everywhere. You're going to build a nation, as my colleague Dominic Bryan would say, you find a battle that you've won or you lost, doesn't matter, put up a statue and so on. Whereas I think the historians think actually the content of history is really, it can be quite important. And what we've had certainly in Ireland, not like universally, but a kind of a shift from telling a story of nationalism in a way that's kind of rooted in a socially conservative, ethnic kind of take to much more kind of pluralist an inclusive kind of story. So in other words, there's like, we have, even in the UK, you compare like Scottish and English nationalism, we have like really very different kind of stories that are told about nationalism. And sorry, it's a long and rambling question, but I'm wondering, like, to what extent, how important is the role of the historian and the role of the history that is taught in maybe shaping how nationalism functions and operates, and how the state can use nationalism in oppressive or other kind of negative ways?
Well, I would say it's a great question, because I think we as historians, we're not as open as we should be to our audiences about exactly why we're doing what we're doing. Because we don't spend our lives reading and writing books just for the sake of the pure pleasure of, sitting in libraries and dusting off old volumes and then opening our computer and torturing ourselves with producing prose that may or anyway. But so there's a reason we do this. And I think I don't know if I was completely frank about this in my last book, but I think in my next book, I'll say what I said to you, which is that I'm interested in the history of democracy, and I'm not, in liberal democracy, and I can define that, and I don't presume that my readers are interested in that as well, but if they are, this is where I stand. And when I study the history of liberal democracy, I want to really look in a clear-eyed fashion about the forces that went into trying to produce it at one point, and explaining why they failed, with full appreciation of what people intended and what they believed they were doing, and then what they accomplished, right? And if people believe that democracy, the nation state was the only way to produce democracy, I'll reproduce that view, and then I'll consult my political science friends and say, is that true? Is it in fact true that democracy flourishes only under these conditions? And and draw upon other social sciences as well, and try to come up for readers interested in this subject with a compelling narrative, right? But I think we probably should be open about what we do, but we should also try to justify what we do in terms that will interest readers. And I'll say one final thing, which is I think we can go too far in either direction. That is, write a monograph that only we read, that only we understand. I think that's a wanting approach, but we can also become very popularizing. I'm not going to mention the name, but there's a British author of German descent who's recently written a book about East Germany, popular history of East Germany, that's deeply flawed, because it really ignores in a balanced way the history of that land. But it has received positive reviews in about 20 different serious British, mostly British journals, and I think it's a historian doing something that other historians have to indicate that this is not within the realm of what we do in terms of evidence and documentation, and the attempt to have a full view of what's. I mean, this is obviously an abbreviation of my issues with that book, but in other words, just because a book is popular and readable doesn't make it good history. And I think there's too often a sense that that's what we need. It's not what we need. we need history that, as you're suggesting, is productive of meaning, that we can use, hopefully, for the ends of democracy.
Just one note about being more reflective about your own positionality, and be open about it. I think that's where you would move very closely to what anthropologists do and are quite good at. Just speak for my own discipline.
Double hermeneutics, is that right? Is that what you're doing? I forgot the term. There's so many options, but one ends up being the dominant one for various reasons. Usually state, who teaches at schools, it's a state. State demands can change. We can see how, emphasis changes, for example, on I don't know, in Germany you have a debate about German War Guild, for example, the debate in the 1980s about, I forgot the German term for it, I'm sorry, but Historikerschein, that's right, yes. And in Russia you have, now there's a popular term, decolonization of Russian history, for example. Look at the 1920s, there was a whole movement, state-sponsored movement of decolonization, trying to see how Russian state was jailer of the people and promoting alternative views of history and so forth. And then it was killed down. So where do we find ourselves? Well, I mean, it depends where you work. If you work in Russia, you pretty much can find to kind of follow the overall, although it's much more complex there even now, but overall direction. But what if you write and nobody wants to read? But so anyway, we are interacting with the social things, particularly history, national history, particularly history of contentious period, contested Europe and so forth. We are kind of participants, and depends what we want to achieve is a factor in what we write and what we do as historians.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for taking us into conflicted Europe without fighting. And thank you, the audience, fantastic questions. And so hopefully we will, within some months, definitely next year, have another Berkeley, Belfast or Belfast-Berkeley conversation. Might be in Berkeley. It will probably be another discipline to give everybody a chance. But thank you so much.
Thank you.